In 1941, Japan believed the entire world was distracted. While Hitler advanced across Europe, Japanese generals looked to the Pacific and saw a unique opportunity. The empire sought to expand its borders and dominate Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and Hawaii. To do so, there was one inevitable obstacle: the United States. Japanese leadership viewed Americans as slow, overconfident, and unwilling to fight far from home. That perception fueled the decision to strike first. The plan was simple and bold: destroy the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor before it could respond. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, a Japanese task force crossed the Pacific in silence. It included 6 aircraft carriers and over 300 planes ready for the attack. At dawn, the sky over Hawaii filled with enemy aircraft. The alarm sounded too late. Within minutes, the harbor was engulfed in explosions and smoke. Ships burned. Men tried to fight back under heavy fire, and the USS Arizona was destroyed in a single blast that killed over 1,000 sailors. It was the blow Tokyo believed would crush American morale. In Japan's capital, the attack was hailed as a triumph. The press glorified the feat, and the government saw it as the beginning of a new era. But among the leaders, some had doubts. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, is said to have murmured, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible determination." He understood that Japan had won only the first battle and awakened an enemy with limitless resources and will. Hours later, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. In his speech, he called that day a date which will live in infamy and declared war on Japan. America's response was immediate. The entire nation mobilized. Factories were converted into military production lines. Workers of all kinds began building weapons, ships, and planes. American industry turned into a war machine. Meanwhile, Japan still believed it had control of the situation. But the tide was beginning to turn. The power rising on the other side of the ocean was not only military, it was national. America's response would be total. The Japanese Empire had started a war it could not win. Months later came the first retaliation, a daring and symbolic mission aimed at the heart of Japan itself, the Doolittle Raid. The plan, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, was to launch B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier, something never attempted before. The USS Hornet sailed silently in April 1942, carrying 16 planes. When spotted by Japanese ships, the pilots were ordered to take off immediately, far ahead of schedule. Hours later, Tokyo heard explosions. The attack caused little physical damage, but had immense psychological impact. For the first time, Japan realized the enemy could reach its homeland. The myth of imperial invincibility began to crumble. In response, Japanese leaders planned a major offensive to eliminate the Americans once and for all, a decision that would lead them straight into a trap. In the following months, Japan advanced toward the Coral Sea, aiming to isolate Australia. What they didn't know was that their communication codes had been broken. In 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea began, the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never saw each other. It was fought entirely by aircraft. Japan lost the carrier, Shoho, and suffered heavy damage to other ships, forcing a retreat. It was a modest U.S. victory, but it shattered the myth of Japanese invulnerability. The defeat led Japan's high command to plan a larger, decisive attack on Midway Island. The goal was to lure and destroy the American fleet completely. They assembled their best carriers and veteran pilots. However, the Americans already knew the plan. They had cracked the codes and were waiting. In June 1942, the sea looked calm, but the fate of the Pacific was about to change. Japanese planes attacked Midway at dawn, inflicting damage but failing to wipe out defenses. Hours later, American bombers struck back. The attack was chaotic and risky, but devastating. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers, Akagi, Sakaga, and Soryu were destroyed within minutes. The fourth, Hiryu, was sunk the next day. The Battle of Midway marked the turning point. Japan lost its best pilots and its strategic confidence. The empire ceased to be the hunter and became the hunted. The war, once offensive, turned into a slow and inevitable defense. Even with these losses, Tokyo still believed it could endure. In August 1942, U.S. forces landed on Guadalcanal, a small island in the Solomon Archipelago, but strategically vital. The Japanese were building an airstrip there. The American assault was swift and caught them off guard. The fighting that followed was brutal. Jungle, heat, and disease compounded the daily combat. Guadalcanal became a test of endurance. Naval battles around the island were fierce, the Solomon Sea filled with wrecks. But unlike earlier campaigns, the Americans did not retreat. They learned to fight under the same harsh conditions as the enemy. After months, Japan abandoned the island in silence. The loss was more than territorial. It was symbolic. Guadalcanal proved the empire could be defeated. The initiative in the war shifted permanently to the Allies. From then on, the U.S. strategy was called island hopping, skipping heavily fortified positions and focusing on strategic targets, cutting Japan's supply lines. The advance was methodical and devastating. Japan, isolated and strangled by naval blockade, began to feel the full weight of industrial war. In 1944, the next objective was Saipan, in the Mariana Islands. Capturing it would place B-29 bombers within direct range of Tokyo. Japan believed its defenses were impenetrable, but when the American fleet began bombardment, they collapsed quickly. The battle for Saipan was fierce. The Japanese dug tunnels and fought stubbornly, but they were overwhelmed by U.S. material superiority. When defeat was certain, many Japanese soldiers and civilians committed suicide. The result of propaganda that claimed surrender was dishonor. The fall of Saipan triggered a crisis in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The myth of invincibility was gone. With Saipan secured, the path was open. Japanese cities began to be bombed. The empire, now cornered, prepared to defend its final positions. Among them, Iwo Jima. The island, rocky and small, had immense strategic value. It would serve as an airbase for bombers attacking Japan. The Japanese turned it into an underground fortress, digging miles of tunnels and hiding weapons in Mount Suribachi. In February 1945, U.S. forces landed under intense bombardment. It seemed nothing had survived, but the Japanese had waited for the perfect moment to strike. When the Marines advanced, they were met with concentrated fire. The combat was bloody and relentless. Every inch of ground was won at great cost. After days of fighting, the Marines captured Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag. The battle raged for weeks. In the end, nearly all Japanese defenders were dead. Iwo Jima fell, but at the cost of thousands of lives. Even facing inevitable defeat, Japan refused to surrender. Only Okinawa remained, the last barrier before the invasion of the home islands. In April 1945, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers waited for the Americans, prepared to fight to the end. The American naval bombardment was the most intense of the war. When the Marines landed, they met ferocious resistance. Japan's underground defenses turned the terrain into a fiery maze. Civilians, influenced by propaganda, were tragically caught in the conflict. At Okinawa, Japan unleashed its final weapon, mass kamikaze attacks. Hundreds of suicide planes struck the American fleet, sinking dozens of ships. Despite the heavy cost, the Allied advance continued. When the resistance ended, General Mitsuru Ushijima committed seppuku. Okinawa was destroyed. The battle had cost over 100,000 Japanese lives and more than 12,000 American. The Japanese Empire, once dreaming of ruling the Pacific, was now fighting only to survive. The war exposed the fatal flaw in its strategy, underestimating an enemy that combined industrial power, organization, and determination at unprecedented levels. Japanese spirit faced American steel and was crushed. The path to Japan was open. The end had not yet come, but it was only a matter of time. The empire that began the war believing in its own superiority now faced the consequences of its arrogance. And in the end, when the fire stopped and the lead ceased to fall,